So welcome everybody to this preview show for the Data Jam, which is taking place on November 28th. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Tony Fish, who is one of our keynote speakers, and dare I say, a maverick to the insurance industry. But Tony, welcome firstly. And could I just ask you to introduce yourself, a bit about your background, and kind of then we can talk a bit about what you're going to be covering at the event.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you for inviting me. I kind of like the word maverick because nobody knows what it means, and I have an eclectic series of industries I've worked across, and an eclectic number of companies I've both helped found and sell. All of my basis is all about data, and that's where my central piece is. And the insurance companies and the insurance industry is going into a phase of understanding data better. And there's a number of people and industries who have been around thinking about this stuff for a bit longer. So I think some of my maverickness is what can we share and learn from other industries?
Great. And I think, and you've written a book, and we might come on to that in a bit. And one of the themes in the book is about asking the right questions in order to make better decisions. So my question to you is, how do businesses identify the questions that they should be asking rather than sticking to the ones that they've already asked?
Yes, I'm always interested in how data can help us make better decisions. And in there actually fundamentally lies a problem, because most of us have read a few articles and they all go, you need more data to make better decisions. I come along immediately as the maverick and say, that's not always the case. And there's a bunch of reasons which we'll explore on the day and throughout the event of why that's true. So you can't just assume more data is better. And you can't assume because you've got more data, you're going to make better decisions. In fact, there's a bunch of data which doesn't help you with decision making at all. And to your point, what questions did we not know we needed to ask? And that's where I center on helping companies, and I'll give some frameworks during the talk about how companies can ask questions they didn't even know they had to ask.
Yeah. So if there is this tendency to ask the same question kind of repeatedly of the data, that must be impacting customer outcomes and customer experiences. Have you got an example of how that manifests itself?
So the simplest one, where everyone asks the same question, and if you take either a weekly or monthly management meeting or board meeting, the first thing we always sit down so often is with the numbers. And numbers drive incessantly because it is a bunch of data. And we assume, number one, the data that's presented to us in the financials is right. And we actually have no provability of, more often than not, if it is or not. The second one is the way we apply accounting principles change fundamentally the numbers that we can present quite simply. The way companies decide to add or subtract margin or costs change fundamentally the numbers. Yet we start so many of our meetings talking about the numbers, and they then frames the discussion. And because the numbers are, centrally interesting to everybody, we've all become very skilled in them. Yet we don't leave enough time for all the rest of the discussions. And we find the rest of the discussions get compressed into not a lot of time. And therefore, we don't ask questions about all the rest of the stuff that's going on in the business. And we don't know how to rotate through different meetings. So we ask and focus on different areas. There are all some basic stuff. The piece that continually comes up is that far too many people expect that data somehow magically is going to tell them what to do. But that is that most data is actually all our history and our past, and it's collected about our history and past. And therefore you need different tools if you're going to project futures. But the problem with projecting futures, it depends on the assumptions that you make. And if you want one question that people don't go back and ask is, what are the assumptions that we're making, both of the data that we've got and of the framework we're using to predict the future?
And I guess you're talking a bit there about kind of the culture of the organization, aren't you? Motivated by financial metrics, financial data that stimulates a conversation that kind of goes in the wrong in the wrong way that might then be at the detriment to customer outcomes. Well, what is it that needs to change then? Is it, and who is that driver for change?
Yeah,
it's difficult.
We're all the driver of change. So, classic example I love using is one of traffic light system for red, yellow, green for awareness of what's going on. And the reality is most people end up with an incentive or a bonus, which is based on getting all of the metrics to green. So everyone gets them to green. Everybody celebrates green. It's like, but that doesn't mean the business is good. It just means those particular metrics are good. And you never ask the question, were they the right metrics in the first place? And actually, when you've optimized for one metric and made it green, you will have compromised something else. But where's the statement that says, because we've achieved this, we've compromised that? And these are the things that need unpacking with data, that we get obsessed with trying to get things done, but we forget the consequences. And that, effectively, my whole book and a lot of my thinking is, what are the consequences of the decisions you've made? And sometimes you didn't make the decision because you were given the incentive. And we drive towards being rewarded. And if your reward takes you in the wrong direction, who's there asking the question? Am I doing the right thing? And you're spot on, Jeremy, in that observation of the culture. If it doesn't allow you to ask that question, nobody is. And if nobody is, then one of the questions you started with, what's a question we don't ask?
Yeah. So there's a lot in that, isn't there? I think, culture we just touched on there. I think leadership as well, and understanding the importance of data and where it's come from, what you're trying to achieve. And you've spoken about asking better questions to improve decision making at a leadership level. So what's the connection between asking the right questions and innovation within a company? Because a lot of what we're going to be talking about at the Data Jam are innovations around technology, AI, automation, all this kind of sexy stuff over here. But it seems to me that there are a bunch of fundamentals that you've got to get right in order to be able to leverage those kind of tech.
And everybody, I say everybody, there's a bunch of people who always want to be at an edge, which sounds the innovative piece. And, we now have more AI experts who have read 2 articles, who have become experts in something they have no idea about, but are now portraying all sorts of fascinating things with such authority that it makes it tremendously difficult for people to challenge what's being said. And organizations are as bad as this, where edicts and mandates come down, yet somebody wants to ask the question, they're not allowed to. And these are the bits that we do need to unpack, which says, actually, somebody in the organization knows good questions we should be asking of both the data, the processes, the methods, the culture. How do we allow that to happen? And if you want to do innovation in truth, we have to find ways of asking better questions, not assuming, or saying, no, we've tried that, or we're going to do this. And part of the innovation piece so much is, what is your response to questions?
So it's really interesting what you're talking about there, because I think you're pointing towards or edging towards a kind of philosophy, a culture, or something around, it kind of sounds abstract, doesn't it? Which is kind of, it's, you start off by talking about the financial data and that driving decisions. Well, that's almost linear, straightforward. But to have a philosophy around data, a culture around data, how do you define that kind of philosophy? And especially with boards and, as I've said, leadership teams that are kind of driven by those, those hard metrics.
And therein lies a fascinating reaction, where some companies, you wander in, and I wander into the board, and I talk about data philosophy. The openness and willingness to chat about being able to hold multiple ideas at the same time and giving them equal value is incredibly welcomed and embraced, and allows, discussions about many topics. And most people don't understand that actually maths is a philosophy, computing is a philosophy, actually financials in fairly much is a philosophy because it's a language of maths, but we don't want to think, we think they're sciences and they're exact. And there is a tendency that we have that we want something to be factual, but we actually don't know if that fact is true and to whom it's true. And this is why we've got to get back to asking questions about what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. And we can guise it up as purpose and we can guise it up as many things. But unless we understand the questions we're supposed to ask and why we're supposed to ask them, and if we have the freedom to ask those questions, we're going to really struggle. So yeah, philosophy, some people really hate it because they think it's dandy bandy and it's really abstract and it allows you to guise behind a lot of things. I look at philosophy as somebody who's able to hold many ideas of equal value in their mind at the same time without giving a particular bias or preference or framing to one, and actually searching which one of them has a better outcome for what they want to try and achieve.
Within the insurance sector, I mean, we talk a lot about data architecture and structured data and data formats and how we're going to do all this. And I think one of the problems that you're going to touch on at the conference is kind of how do you kind of organize, how do you think about the data, and the ontology of data, I think is how you phrase it. What are the problems that, firstly, do you want to just give us a definition of that, and then what are the problems that arise if you don't get that right?
Yeah, ontology is just a fascinating area, and it is all about structure and how you determine structure. And and I'll give some examples when we're at the conference of classic when people get it wrong. What ontology says is how you allocate the set of words that you like, i.e. name, first name, second name, address, to something, and how that then actually forms the data and the only types of analysis you can then do on that data. If you start with what's termed a different top level ontology, you can ask different questions of the data. Now, you might not be able to ask the ones you wanted, but you can ask different. So different ontologies fundamentally allow you to answer different questions. Every company has an ontology. And actually, most companies don't understand their ontology. So when they come to ask questions of their data set and they find it doesn't produce an answer, they think the data's rubbish. But actually, if you're asking the wrong question of the wrong ontology, you will get rubbish. When companies combine, which is the big thing that's happening so often, and you combine two large data sets, believing that more data has value, when you combine two different ontologies, you actually create what is known as quantum risk or phantom users. And then you can actually completely believe that something's about to happen. And actually it exists nothing other than because you've created or used two ontologies. So two structures of data, which realistically should not have been combined. And this isn't about labels. This is actually way beyond labeling.
Yeah. So that's really fascinating, because you're absolutely right. The conversation really quickly moves towards the data must be wrong. That is why we're getting the wrong answers. And yeah, the structure, as you've been talking about there, is really important. You talked about kind of mergers, acquisitions, data architecture, things being merged, and business is complex. It isn't straightforward. If it was, it would all be easy and we wouldn't be having these events, would we? But I mean, what are some of the practical steps that boards need to take in order to be equipped for kind of this new kind of data-driven world that we find ourselves in, with the technologies that underpin it and the opportunities that lay beyond?
Yeah, I'll always come back to a fundamental is there's a fiduciary duty that all directors owe, which is that they should be able to ask questions that other people didn't even know they had to ask. And I think this is the most important thing is if we find we're asking the same questions, that actually that's the time to get external help. Because if you're not asking different questions, then you're not asking better questions. And therefore you've reached the limit of the capacity of the people around the table. And when you reach the capacity, good leadership turns around and says, how do we change the capacity and skill sets and the availability of knowledge around the table to be able to ask better questions? you're spot on. The complexity of what we're now dealing with has got out of any one person knowing what's going on. So we need to act as teams, and those teams need to be diverse, both by every measure possible, including neurodiversity. But beyond that, if we go back to that last piece about the structure of data, we have a fundamental, we all now have supply chains, and we all expect our supply chain to share data, and we're being asked increasingly to share more data, but we only share it in the ontology that we've collected it. So when one of the questions I go back to boards and say, okay, you've got this data from your supply chain, do you understand the ontology of the supply chain's data set to actually determine if it actually can be aligned to your data sets? Or have you just received data, somebody's doing analysis of data, and actually we're creating basically reports which are coming to you, but fundamentally you won't be able to understand it, because actually you don't understand why they've done what they do and how they do it. And that's not disrespectful. These are just questions we didn't know we had to ask 10 years ago. These are questions have emerged because we've entered into this very fast-moving, data-driven world. But actually data is something we don't sit back and ask the question, what actually is data?
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Tony, thanks ever so much for joining us and giving us an insight into some of the areas that you're going to dive into a bit deeper on the day at Data Jam on the 28th of November. And I'm sure, as we've been talking about, there'll be plenty of questions for you as well on the day.
Oh, very much excited. Looking forward to seeing you on the day, Jeremy. Thank you.